March 10th, 1945. In a single night, more people would burn alive in Tokyo than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Survivors said the sky glowed like a second sun as 279 American B-29s roared overhead, dropping 1,665 tons of napalm, fire that clung to skin, walls, and streets, unstoppable once ignited. Winds turned to hurricanes, rivers boiled, and entire districts vanished in minutes as temperatures reached 1,800 degrees. Children melted into pavement, mothers suffocated before the fire even touched them, and soldiers, trained to die before surrender, stood frozen, powerless, as their capital dissolved into ash. When the firestorm finally ended, Tokyo was silent, burned flat, and more than 100,000 civilians were gone. It was the night Japanese soldiers first whispered that victory was impossible, not because of the atomic bomb or the battlefield, but because America had forged a weapon that turned cities into fuel and war into fire. Tokyo, winter of 1945. The war had dragged on for nearly 4 relentless years, and Japan, once confident, once convinced of divine victory, was exhausted but still unbroken. Factories still hummed, civilians still labored. The military still preached sacrifice as the highest honor. Every boy was told he would one day become a soldier. Every girl was taught her body existed for the empire. And in every school, on every street corner, banners told a nation surrounded by blockade, starvation, and mounting losses that victory was inevitable, because the emperor willed it. But across the Pacific, in the United States, a different kind of war was brewing, one no battlefield, rifle, or fleet could decide. American bombers had struggled for years to destroy Japan's war machine. High-altitude precision bombing failed. Weather, jet streams, and Japanese defenses protected the cities below. Targets that were supposed to be destroyed remained standing. Missions flew thousands of miles and returned with little to show. To military leadership, the message was clear. If Japan wouldn't break on the battlefield, then fire would do what steel could not. That shift, cold, brutal, and strategic, brought one man to the center of history, General Curtis LeMay, a commander known not for charisma but for results, a man who believed that ending a war faster, no matter the cost, saved more lives than letting it drag on. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't emotional, he was clinical. To him, victory was math, firepower multiplied by time, divided by resistance. LeMay looked at Japan and saw a terrifying advantage. Japanese cities were made of wood and paper, flammable from roof to doorframe, and so he made a decision that would change warfare forever. He approved mass production of a new American invention, one born in Harvard laboratories, engineered not for explosions but for suffering: napalm. Unlike TNT, napalm didn't simply detonate, it ignited, it spread, it crawled, it clung to flesh and could not be extinguished, not with water, not with dirt, not with anything. Once burning, it fed itself. It turned oxygen into fuel and cities into furnaces. The unit chosen to deliver this weapon was the 21st Bomber Command, flying the largest, most advanced bomber the world had ever seen, the B-29 Superfortress. Crews trained relentlessly, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and engineers, men barely old enough to shave, carrying thousands of pounds of fire to the other side of the world. Every flight was a gamble. Every raid meant hours over ocean, engine failures, anti-aircraft guns, fighters, storms, and uncertainty. But in February 1945, LeMay made another radical call. He ordered his bombers to fly lower, at night, with almost all defensive guns removed so they could carry more napalm. It was a decision pilots called insane. It was a decision that would ignite the skies over Japan. On the ground, civilians had no idea what was coming. Children practiced bamboo spear drills. Families stored buckets of sand to put out fires. Propaganda promised the Japanese spirit alone could stop American machines. Yet, officers in Tokyo knew the truth. The Navy was shattered, airfields were empty, oil was gone, and the empire was dying, but no one dared say it aloud. Among them were survivors who would later speak: Katsumoto Satome, just a teenager during the raid, Haruyo Nihei, who lost her family in moments, and countless others whose names history never recorded. They remembered the tension in the air before the first sirens, the distant hum, the rumble that grew until it shook the earth, and then the sky filled with aircraft so low some said they could see faces. What happened next would become the deadliest air raid in human history. A night when fire behaved not like a weapon, but like a living, consuming force. A night that erased entire districts. A night when rivers boiled, wind roared like storms, and tens of thousands never made it to morning. And for the first time, soldiers and civilians alike whispered something forbidden, something unimaginable. We cannot win. This wasn't just another attack. It wasn't just another raid. It was the moment belief shattered. This is the story of the American weapon that made Japanese soldiers stop believing in victory. By early 1945, Japan stood on the edge of collapse, but no one inside the country was allowed to admit it. Newspapers still printed victory slogans, radios still broadcast confidence, school children still bowed toward the imperial palace and recited promises to defend the emperor with their lives. But beneath the surface, the truth was unavoidable. Japan was running out of time. The war had begun with triumphs: Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong. Japan expanded rapidly, its empire stretching across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The military convinced itself and its people that the West was weak, soft, morally inferior, incapable of enduring prolonged sacrifice. Japan believed spirit, Yamato Damashi, would overcome industry. But by late 1944, the tide had reversed. The Imperial Navy was shattered. The once proud carrier fleets were now rusting wrecks or graves at the bottom of the Pacific. Fuel shortages crippled aircraft production. Pilots were rushed into cockpits with barely enough training to fly, much less fight. Kamikazes, once unthinkable, became policy. Yet even with defeat closing in, one illusion remained. Japan believed the United States could not touch its homeland. The home islands, Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku, and Hokkaido, were mountains away from the nearest Allied base. The Pacific was too vast, the skies too unpredictable, the islands too heavily fortified. Japan's leaders believed geography itself was a shield. But in September 1944, something appeared high above the clouds, so high Japanese fighter pilots struggled to reach it. A plane unlike anything Japan had ever seen, the B-29 Superfortress. With a pressurized cabin, remote-controlled defensive guns, advanced navigation systems, and engines capable of carrying enormous bomb loads across oceans, the B-29 was not just an aircraft, it was a statement of industrial dominance. The first raids were disappointing. Bombs missed targets. Weather ruined visibility. Jet streams carried bombs off course. American generals realized that precision bombing, effective in Europe, was nearly impossible over Japan, and so a new type of warfare took shape. Back in the United States in quiet university laboratories, a group of chemists led by Louis Fieser had created a substance meant for one purpose: to burn cities, napalm. It wasn't just fuel, it was a living fire, sticky, hungry, relentless. It burned hotter and longer than gasoline. It clung to whatever it touched. If it landed on a person, it fused with skin. Water couldn't stop it. It only spread the flame. Military planners realized something chilling. Japan's major cities were built almost entirely from wood and paper. Dense neighborhoods, narrow streets, flammable homes. A single spark could erase entire districts. Strategists began asking a dark question. If Japan's cities could become fuel, why aim at factories at all? The decision now rested with one man, General Curtis LeMay. To some, he was cold, to others, brutally efficient, but to his crews, he was the kind of commander who never sent men anywhere he wouldn't fly himself. LeMay studied the failures of earlier missions. He examined weather reports. He reviewed maps. Then he issued an order that stunned every pilot under his command. E will attack at night, low altitude, no defensive guns. E crews stared in disbelief. Removing guns felt suicidal. Japanese night fighters were still active. Anti-aircraft guns dotted the cities. But LeMay calculated that altitude and fuel mattered more than defense. Flying low meant accuracy. Removing weight meant more incendiaries. And darkness meant fewer losses. His logic was stark. If the war ended faster, fewer Americans, and yes, fewer Japanese, would die. Meanwhile, life in Tokyo dragged on under rationing and fear. Blackouts were mandatory. Water pumps and fire breaks were installed. Neighborhood fire brigades practiced drills with bamboo buckets, whistles, and ropes, tools that would prove powerless against what was coming. Children slept with bundles containing a family photo, rice balls, and a good luck charm, ready to flee at the first siren. Among them was a teenager named Katsumoto Satome, who would later become one of the most important witnesses of the night. He remembered the city's strange quiet, broken only by distant engines and rumors whispered in fear. America will burn Tokyo. Across the sea on the island of Tinian, ground crews worked through the night loading long rows of B-29 seconds. Each bomber received a cargo designed not to shatter buildings, but to ignite them. Small incendiary bomblets filled with jellied gasoline were packed into cluster containers. Once released, they would burst open midair, scattering hundreds of flaming canisters across entire neighborhoods. Pilots climbed aboard. Engines growled to life. The first aircraft lifted off into the darkness, and one after another followed, until the sky above the runway looked like a constellation in motion. The men inside were silent. Some prayed, some stared forward. Some tried to convince themselves that what they were about to do was necessary. Far ahead, 1,500 miles away, a city slept, unaware that this fleet wasn't coming to destroy a military base or a factory. It was coming to test a theory that an entire city could burn at once, and the fire that was about to fall would change the war and the world forever. The engines thundered toward Japan, toward history, toward fire. The night was almost over, and Tokyo's darkest hours had not yet begun. The first warning sirens in Tokyo sounded at 12:08 a.m., but to many residents it felt routine. They had heard alarms before, raids that came and went, bombs that fell far away, or planes that never reached the city. People hesitated, wondering if this would be another false alarm. But then a low rumble appeared in the night sky. Not one plane, not 10, hundreds. Windows rattled. The earth seemed to vibrate. In the darkness, Japanese spotters saw massive silhouettes flying lower than ever before, so low some said they could feel the tremor of engines in their bones. The first wave of B-29 superfortresses dropped bright white flares, markers for the bombers behind them. They descended slowly, drifting like strange artificial stars, illuminating blocks of wooden houses below. Survivors later said that light felt like judgment. Then came the fire. Cluster bombs burst open midair, scattering thousands of canisters of napalm across neighborhoods. Little metal cylinders that tumbled, bounced, then split open, and instantly the city ignited. Flames rose from roofs like exploding matches. Street after street erupted as napalm adhered to wood, tatami mats, clothing, skin. No one had seen fire behave like this. Fire that crawled, fire that hunted, fire that didn't flicker but roared. The wind began to shift. At first it blew casually, then harder, then violently, feeding the inferno. Within minutes, the bombing stopped mattering. The city itself became the weapon. A firestorm was born. Temperatures spiked to over 1,800 degrees. Hot, enough to melt metal, glass, and bone. Entire neighborhoods became ovens. People fled, but the flames outran them. Mothers carried infants whose clothes fused into their skin. Children clung to adults, then slipped from their hands, lost in smoke so thick it blinded. People tried to take refuge in rivers, but the water boiled, filled with burning oil from airborne incendiaries. One witness recalled, voice trembling decades later, the river became a grave. Japanese firefighters rushed toward the flames, but their pumps failed as pressure collapsed. Their buckets, the same ones children practiced with in drills, were nothing against walls of fire taller than buildings. Inside the B-29 seconds, American crews stared down as Tokyo vanished beneath clouds of smoke and fire. Some felt pride, others trembled. One gunner whispered into his oxygen mask, "My God, what have we done?" Another wrote in his journal later, "We weren't bombing a city, we were watching it burn, but this mission was not over." As fires consumed districts, a new danger arose. The firestorm produced tornado-like winds powerful enough to pull oxygen and people into the flames. Survivors described being lifted off the ground, dragged toward heat so intense their clothing ignited just from proximity. Some suffocated where they stood, their lungs scalded by superheated air before flames ever reached them. The turning point came when escape routes collapsed. Bridges glowed red, collapsing into molten frames. Streets were blocked by debris or bodies. Families huddled in open fields, but sparks rained from the sky. One soldier later confessed, "We had trained to fight, but no training prepares you to fight fire like that." By the time the last bomber turned homeward, Tokyo was unrecognizable. Hours later, flames still raged, consuming anything left that could burn. When dawn finally arrived, the city was silent, not paused, not waiting, gone. Blackened chimneys stood like gravestones. The smell of ash and burned flesh hung in the air so thick, survivors vomited just breathing. Bodies, tens of thousands of them, lay in streets, in rivers, in piles where people had collapsed together in their final moments. A Japanese policeman, overwhelmed by the devastation, wrote, "This was the night I understood the war was already lost." And somewhere in the ruins, a child looked at the sky, no longer believing the emperor could protect them. Tokyo had not merely been bombed, Tokyo had been consumed, and Japan for the first time felt defeat, not as fear, but as certainty. When the flames finally died, the silence in Tokyo was unlike anything the survivors had ever known. No birds, no radios, no voices calling orders or prayers, only the soft hiss of smoldering ruins and the distant cries of those still searching for someone, anyone, still alive. Dawn revealed a city that no longer resembled streets and homes, but a flat black landscape where mothers, soldiers, shopkeepers, and infants were indistinguishable from ash. Japanese emergency workers moved through the remains with cloths tied around their faces to block the smell. But nothing could stop it. One investigator wrote in his notebook, later found stained with soot. The air tasted of burned iron, burned wood, and burned people. Entire blocks had become mass graves where bodies melted together, In some places, only white bones marked where families once slept. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, burns so severe skin peeled off at the slightest touch. Doctors lacked medicine, bandages, anesthesia. Many survivors did not receive treatment, only water, prayers, or silent company until they stopped breathing. One nurse later said, "We did not heal. We merely watched people die slower." And in the midst of tragedy, something else happened. Not immediately, but gradually. Soldiers returning to Tokyo stared at the ruins in disbelief. Many had fought in China and the Pacific and witnessed terrible things. But nothing compared to this. This was the destruction of a nation's heart. A lieutenant, hardened by years of combat, later admitted, "I knew then we had already lost. I just didn't know when we would admit it." That night was not the end. It was the beginning of a campaign. In the weeks that followed, American bombers returned again and again. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, one by one, cities burned. By summer, 66 Japanese cities were firebombed. Factories, homes, temples, schools gone. In total, more than 40% of Japan's urban area vanished in flames. The psychological collapse was even greater. Children no longer trusted air raid drills. Families buried what little they had left. Millions fled cities, walking roads that stretched endlessly into the countryside. Food shortages deepened, and hunger became as common as grief. The belief in divine victory, the idea that Japan could never be defeated, began to fracture. Inside government walls, leaders argued. Some insisted Japan must fight on, even if every city burned. Others saw reality clearly. America's industry was unstoppable, and Japan was running out of everything: metal, food, oil, time. Hope itself was thinning. Among survivors, trauma lived quietly. Katsumoto Saotome, the boy who fled through the fire, spent years grappling with what he saw: burning children, rivers full of bodies, streets alive with flame. He grew up not to avenge that night, but to preserve its memory. His books and testimony helped future generations understand that behind casualty numbers were faces, voices, names. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the American military studied the results. Reports declared the operation an overwhelming success. In cold language, they measured destruction in percentages, square miles, and industrial output. Yet some airmen carried their own wounds. A handful later admitted they felt pride mixed with guilt, a duality they never fully escaped. Historians still debate whether the firebombing or the atomic bombs broke Japan's will. Officially, Japan surrendered 5 months later, after Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the Soviet invasion. But many scholars, and even some Japanese wartime officials, later said the fire raids were the true death blow. The bombs ended the war. The firebombing made defeat believable. For Japan, the consequences were immeasurable. 8.5 million people were left homeless. Cities that had existed for centuries were leveled in a season, and generations later, children and grandchildren of survivors still carry stories passed down like scars, lessons carved not into stone but memory. Yet from the ashes came rebuilding. Tokyo rose again, not as the wooden maze it once was, but as a modern city. Survivors raised families. Life continued. But no one who lived through that night forgot the moment when the sky rained fire and everything they believed about war, honor, and destiny changed forever. Operation Meeting House did more than destroy Tokyo. It shattered the belief that Japan could endure anything and still prevail. And for the first time, the nation understood the war was no longer about glory. It was about survival. In the end, the story of Tokyo's firestorm is not just about destruction. It is about what war reveals when all illusions burn away. It showed that even nations built on pride and sacrifice are vulnerable. That belief alone cannot stop machines, fire, or the weight of industrial power. For Japan, the night of March 10th stripped away the myth of invincibility. It forced military leaders, soldiers, and civilians to look beyond loyalty and honor and confront a simple truth. No amount of courage could change the outcome once the war became a contest of production, technology, and relentless escalation. Yet within the suffering, there were moments of heartbreaking bravery. Firefighters who ran toward flames knowing their tools were useless. Parents who shielded their children with their own bodies. Neighbors who carried the elderly on their backs through walls of heat. In a night shaped by strategy and steel, humanity, fragile, frightened, and fighting to survive, remained the most powerful presence. Curtis LeMay later said something controversial and haunting. If we had lost the war, we would have been tried as war criminals. He knew what the operation meant, he knew the cost. But he believed ending the war quickly saved more lives than letting it continue. That is the paradox of warfare. Decisions that end suffering often create it first. The lesson of Tokyo's firebombing is not to glorify violence or justify it. It is to remember the weight of choices made by leaders and the cost paid by those who have no say. It is a reminder that technology can advance faster than morality, and that in war, the line between strategy and atrocity can blur until it disappears entirely. And perhaps above all, this story stands as proof of something history often forgets. Victory is not just about winning battles, it is about deciding what price is acceptable to win them. Japan rebuilt. The United States moved forward. The world entered a nuclear age where destruction on this scale became not extraordinary, but possible at the push of a button. So as we look back at the night Tokyo burned, we must ask ourselves, if humanity could create a weapon that erased a city in hours, what responsibility do we carry to ensure such power is never used lightly again? History cannot be changed, but it can be remembered. And memory is sometimes the only shield we have against repeating what should never happen again. When the smoke cleared and Tokyo stood silent beneath a gray and broken sky, the truth was no longer avoidable. The war was already lost and Japan was forever changed. Operation Meeting House annihilated more than neighborhoods. It shattered conviction, erased certainty, and stripped away the belief that spirit alone could triumph over steel and fire. In just a few hours, a nation built on centuries of discipline and sacrifice faced a new kind of warfare. One where technology, industry, and strategy mattered more than courage or honor. The firebombing campaign that followed left millions homeless, dozens of cities reduced to ash, and a psychological wound deeper than any battlefield defeat. Though the atomic bombs would later define the narrative of Japan's surrender, many historians now agree the night Tokyo burned was the moment Japan began to accept the inevitable. It was the moment hope gave way to survival. And so, from the ashes rose a nation humbled, rebuilt, and determined never again to face devastation of that scale. Because the night Tokyo burned did more than end a phase of war. It marked the moment Japan stopped believing in victory and started counting the cost.